China's presence in Africa is reshaping the continent at a pace the world has never seen before. From modern highways connecting once remote towns to ports that link African countries to global markets, China has become an influential force across the continent. This relationship, forged over decades, is both celebrated and questioned, and severely challenged in some quarters. Today, we explore the origins of China's entry into Africa, examine the reasons behind its deepened interest, and ask, what is the future of Africa's partnership with China? China's growing presence in Africa is a calculated move that began decades ago but gained significant momentum in the early 2000s. While Western nations traditionally approach Africa through development aid, conditional loans, and political leverage, China saw Africa as an opportunity for mutual growth and prosperity with less emphasis on political conditions, which I'll get to later in this video. So you ask the question, when did China's development in Africa start? China's involvement in Africa dates back to the 1950s when African nations began winning independence from colonial powers. At that time, China saw a chance to form alliances with these new nations, positioning itself as an alternative to Western influence. This budding relationship was rooted in shared goals, anti-colonialism, and self-determination. China's support was largely political and ideological, but soon shifted towards a more strategic approach. This foundation was strengthened at the Bandung Conference in 1955, a key meeting of Asian and African leaders that emphasized solidarity and support for nations still fighting colonialism. Here, the seeds of cooperation were planted, setting the stage for future trade, infrastructure, and developmental deals. In the early 2000s, China began its meteoric economic rise, but rapid growth came with an insatiable hunger for resources, and Africa's resource-rich nations were ideal partners. Africa provided everything China needed: oil, minerals, and agricultural products. And in return, African leaders saw an opportunity for fast-paced development. Chinese-African trade rose from $10 billion in year 2000 to more than $200 billion by the year 2020, a staggering increase if you would agree. China offered infrastructure loans and investments with fewer conditions than traditional Western lenders. Not that they didn't have conditions, but fewer conditions. A model that appealed to many African leaders seeking growth without political oversight. But as these relationships grew, concerns about economic dependency and debt burdens began to emerge. In the year 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping unveiled the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, an ambitious infrastructure plan to link Asia, Europe, and Africa through trade and investment. Under BRI, China pledged billions to support African infrastructure projects, with over 40 African countries signing agreements. China's focus on connectivity aimed to build new Silk Roads across continents, including Africa. Some of the most prominent projects under BIR include the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, and extensive port renovations across Africa's eastern coast. While BRI has brought job opportunities and modern infrastructure to African nations, critics warn of potential debt trap diplomacy, where nations that can't pay loans may lose control of their assets to China. Many African countries welcome Chinese investment, but concerns are rising over their heavy reliance on Chinese loans. China now holds significant debt in several African countries, raising fears about potential asset seizures. Nations like Zambia, for instance, have faced financial crises linked to Chinese debt, sparking public outcry and political pushback. China's influence in Africa isn't limited to loans alone. It extends into every major sector, from energy and mining to telecommunications. In infrastructure, China has helped build some of Africa's largest projects, including highways, railways, power plants that are transforming local economies. Chinese companies like Huawei also provide telecommunications infrastructure across the continent, connecting African countries to global digital networks. In the energy sector, China has faced and built massive hydroelectric dams, solar power plants, and energy grids. Meanwhile, Chinese companies dominate Africa's mining industry, extracting resources essential for technology manufacturing. Although these projects create jobs and boost economic growth, some Africans fear that their nations are becoming over reliant on foreign companies and labor, reducing local employment opportunities. Does that remind you of anything? The impact of Chinese influence is also felt culturally and socially. The arrival of Chinese workers and business people has led to a new layer of multiculturalism in African society, but also to some tension. Local workers often complain of poor working conditions in Chinese-run projects, leading to protests and clashes. In some cases, African governments have stepped in to mediate disputes, introducing legal measures to protect local interests. Legally, many of the contracts African nations sign with China favor Chinese companies and require African governments to waive certain regulatory rights. This has raised concerns about sovereignty, as some fear that these agreements compromise Africa's autonomy over its own development. China's involvement in Africa has had undeniable benefits, but it also raises critical questions about dependency and sovereignty. As African countries grow wary of debt and seek more balanced terms, will China adjust its approach? Or is this partnership headed for tension? As the influence of Western powers wanes, China's model presents a new option for African countries, but only time will tell if it's a path to shared prosperity or a new form of dependency. Unlike the West, which has traditionally provided conditional aid that often comes with political and economic reforms, China's approach has focused on non-interference in African domestic affairs. Chinese loans are typically not contingent on the adoption of democratic reforms or governance changes, which has made them attractive to various African governments, particularly those that have struggled under Western-imposed economic policies or faced sanctions. This stance has allowed China to gain goodwill and establish itself as a partner who respects sovereignty and listens, critical point, listens to the African nations. Now, what are the differences in approach between aid and trade? Western aid is often tied to conditions, including governance reforms, democratic practices, and human rights, which has sometimes strained relationships with African countries. Not all African countries are democratic. Not all African countries have the same view on what human rights is. What human rights might mean to the US or the UK might mean something else in Africa. That has to be respected. China's no strings attached philosophy, no strings in inverted commas, philosophy emphasizes trade over aid, allowing African nations to secure infrastructure and development loans without the need to alter their political landscapes. This approach appeals to leaders seeking development while avoiding the politically sensitive reforms demanded by Western nations, which has become tiring over the last few decades at least. Chinese funding, however, comes in the form of loans rather than grants, creating a risk of debt dependency, which I talked about earlier, among African nations. Critics argue that this debt trap diplomacy could ultimately lead to a loss of sovereignty, as heavily indebted nations may be forced to cede control over critical infrastructure, like airports, for example, or resources. Western countries, by comparison, tend to structure aid to reduce debt risk, though at the cost of stricter controls over funded projects. In contrast to Western nations, China places greater emphasis on economic partnerships and cultural exchange programs to foster goodwill. Programs like FOCAC meetings and educational exchange opportunities create a sense of partnership and cultural affinity that has further distinguished China's approach in the eyes of many African leaders. So, is China's strategy working? China's strategy has seen mixed results, that's the truth. On one hand, African nations have made significant strides in infrastructure development and increased trade volumes in China, which has led to economic growth. However, concerns about debt, dependency, and environmental impacts of large-scale projects are rising. China's ability to foster relationships with African governments, often bypassing local populations, has also been a point of contention, as some argue that these deals benefit elites rather than the average citizen. This multifaceted approach, focused on infrastructure, economic aid, and cultural influence, has positioned China as a powerful force in Africa, distinctively different from the Western model. If you're new to my channel or you're returning and you've not subscribed, click on the subscribe button, like, share, and I'll see you in the next one.